Nope. Hold on. You have to make sure you're on this. Otherwise it won't go. There we go. All right. There's a lot in the Bible about remembering things. Like, for example, in Proverbs where it says, "My son, don't forget my teachings, but let your heart keep my commands." But the problem is that human beings have problems with memories, as it says in Ecclesiastes. There's no remembrance of those who came before, and of those who will come after. There will also be no remembrance by those who follow them. It's common nature for us to have problems with memory. Like, it's just human beings, the way we are. There's a common concept that's very popular on the internet right now. It's called the Mandela effect, and it's when you have a memory that's a false memory and you're quite convinced of it. Like, for example, Mr. Monopoly didn't have a monocle. He looked like that. Keep going. Fruit of the Loom doesn't have a cornucopia behind it. It looks like that. But people remember these things. Mr. Rogers, you may remember the opening line of his show. What's the opening line? It's a beautiful what? Day in
the neighborhood.
It's not. It's a beautiful day in this neighborhood. But because most people actually believe it's in the neighborhood, when they made the new movie, they actually used that sentence, even though if you watch it, and you can prove it, watch it on YouTube or whatever, it actually is in this neighborhood, which is a kind of a different thought. It's similar, but it's different. But the reason why they do these sort of things is because of dealing with what's called cognitive dissonance, right? And this is when two actions or ideas are not psychologically consistent with each other. People will do all in their power to change them until they become consistent. And the problem with this is this sort of cognitive dissonance exists all the time in the Bible, and we have all these sort of similar effects when we read the Bible. People will kind of scramble their head and come up with all these different theories as to why their memory of what is in the scripture is correct versus what is actually in the scripture. And sometimes you can even show them what it says in scripture, and it will just disturb them or bother them because they've so wrapped their head around a certain concept. So the important thing we need to always make sure we do is go back to the texts wherever possible. You'll notice in our service, I show the scriptures on this slide. I'm not trying to paraphrase from memory because I would do a poor job. We read a lot of scripture because it's important for us to get back to the text as much as possible. Mega churches have a problem where they'll perhaps try to cater way too much to these cognitive dissonances because they don't want to disturb their audience. But at the same time, small groups will have this problem where cognitive dissonance will just cause more and more splintering. So no matter where you are in the spectrum, in a huge group or a small group, you still have to face this issue. We need to take example from the Bereans, which it says, "As soon as it was night, the brothers sent Paul and Silas off to Berea. On arrival, they went into the synagogue of the Jews. The people here were more open-minded than those in Thessalonica, since they welcomed the message with eagerness and examined the scripture daily to see if these things were so." And we need to have this sort of attitude. If somebody brings us new information, we don't need to just assume it's wrong. We can examine the scripture, test that it's correct, because our memory may be wrong, or maybe we've inferred something in the Bible that didn't exist. Just for example, let's kind of do a memory test here. What was Eve's first sin in the Bible? Now, most people are going to jump to the forbidden fruit, right? Which probably wasn't an apple. That's just an artistic shorthand. However, if you're very aware of what the text says, you can actually make a spiritual case for something else, and I'll show you why. Keep going. Remember what she told the serpent when he asked her the question. She said, "God has said, you shall not eat it, nor shall you touch it, lest you die." But if we go back to what God says, he says, "Of every tree of the garden you may freely eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. For in the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die." He doesn't talk about touching it at all. So there's a lot of questions about that. How did that misinformation come about? Was it a game of telephone? Because remember, he told Adam this information, not Eve. So did Adam relay the information wrong? Or is it perhaps that they read way more into the strictness of the rule and it actually already implies a certain amount of disobedience just by adding extra rules that God didn't intend? There's a lot you can glean from it. But again, if you don't go back to the actual text, if you just make a blanket assumption about it, you can actually miss a lot of the depth of the material. And you can notice that like in arguments you have with your spouse or with your children or whatever, is often when you're discussing things, they will jump to an extreme conclusion of what you're saying. They'll say, well, what you're really telling me is you never want me to do X. And it's like, maybe that's not what I meant. I meant a balanced, nuanced sort of thing. And it could be that that was the situation in the Garden of Eden. The text is not explicit, but my point is that if you go back to the text, you often find these nuanced. And somebody bringing you that nuanced point would be something you might initially reject until you go back to the text and kind of parse it out and figure out that maybe there is a reason for it. We always need to go back to the Bible. But beyond that, because we know that God deals with our human memory, he uses tricks that we can also use ourselves. So here's another memory test. All right, look at these objects, and I'm going to give you about, 15 seconds. Try to remember as many of these images as possible. Okay, so how does God get around the idea that you probably don't have too much of it memorized, but you might have a few, but how does God get around this idea? We can look at his example. So when he used the rainbow, he said, and the bow shall be in the cloud, and I will look upon it that I may remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is upon the earth. Obviously in the context of Noah's Ark. Now God doesn't have to remember anything. He's just taking a humanistic perspective so that we can understand where he's coming from. And obviously the rainbow makes sense because rainbows come from rain. And so if you think of rain, you think of, the fact that there won't be this much rain and all of these things. It makes cohesive sense. So let's go back. Keep going. Sorry, let's go forward. So how many of those 8 items can you remember now? To take a moment. You probably can remember maybe 4 or 5. That's pretty normal. If you can remember more than that, it just means you have an incredibly good memory. But if you don't even remember 4, don't worry. Human memory is usually not that great. Now let's try another approach. Okay, I'm going to go back to this slide. And I'm going to say, okay, it was a cold day. The man was drinking his cup of coffee, put on his scarf, checked the time. Sorry, let me start over. A retired naval officer was drinking his coffee, put on his scarf because it was cold. He checked the time. He realized that he needed to get his mail out to his friend in Montana. It was a dear postcard. And then he got into his blue car. Okay? As it says in the Bible, when you are dealing with remembering something, you want to imprint it onto something tangible. And the truth of the matter is this technique actually works. It says in Deuteronomy, you shall teach them to your children, speaking of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up. Keep going. So, on that memory test, you probably remember more of the 4 things than you did the first time, if you think back to that story. It may not be all of them, but you're probably closer. And that's why God uses narrative in the Bible. It's because when you tell a story, you retain a lot more information because you have context in which to put generic information. But here's another memory test for you, okay? Here I have a bunch of different sea animals, and I'm going to give you 15 seconds to try to remember them. All right, now here's another method that God uses. Remember what it says in Colossians. Therefore, don't let anyone judge you with regard to food or drink or in the matter of a festival or new moon or Sabbath day, because these are a shadow of what was to come. The substance is in the Messiah. So we have shadows in these festivals. We have outlines of the plan. So if I take this picture, let's go on. How many of them can you identify? Right. Probably all of them, right? So the idea is when you're doing these festivals, you're going through a basic outline. You can keep going, Bill. You can go through a basic outline of God's plan. As Christ said in the Passover ceremony, this is my body which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. The fact that we're doing these festivals is a way to point to the whole plan of God. And so it really relays all the detailed information. You don't have to remember as much of the different points. And, the groups that I believe keep to these things generally end up with a more coherent philosophy about some of the basic concepts of God's plan for salvation than those who do not. But on the other hand, remember, these are shadows, right? So these are not necessarily something to get hot and bothered as a whole. We are not worshiping the shadow. We are just using them as a tool. And any tool can be abused. Remember what happens, remember what it says in Ecclesiastes about shadows. For who knows what is good for man in life in the few days of his futile life that he spends like a shadow. In other words, it's using shadow as a concept of something tangible, something that's just kind of part of this earthly life. And we have to remember that. These holidays are not something to worship in of themselves. These are tools to use to worship God, to understand the plan. Keep going. Because remember what happened back in Numbers. Moses made a bronze snake and mounted it on a pole. Whenever someone was bitten and he looked at the bronze snake, he recovered. Okay, so he had that wonderful symbolism. But what happened to that symbolism? If you keep moving on, Hezekiah had to break it into pieces. He broke into pieces the bronze snake that Moses made for the Israelites, burned incense to it up at that time. So remember, when people even get hot and bothered about some of the religious traditions that people get involved in, they say, wow, they're making way too big of a deal about it, this will become idolatrous. Even God's symbols can become like that. So you have to be very careful how you approach it. And remember, these are like a memory symbol. These are things to help you. They are tools. Because, as I said, the human brain is not the best at doing this, so it's just a workaround. But let's not get vain about it, Let's not get overly obsessed. The best thing to do is to go back to the Bible as much as possible. So let's remember that God works to get around these sort of memory traps. Let's read the Bible. Let's take the Bible as a narrative. And let's remember the shadows or the silhouettes that we can use in order to remember the plan of salvation. Go back to the text, frame a narrative, perform a ritual. These are 3 workarounds to help us with our human failure of memory. And they'll help us remember this.